Good morning, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us today for this webinar on Village Enterprises RCT, what it means and why it matters. My name is Laura Burke. I work with Innovations for Poverty Action, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. Just quickly, before we get started, I want to let everyone know that there will be time for a Q&A at the end of the session. So at any time, you can send your questions through the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we will answer your questions at the end. Second, just so you know, the webinar will be recorded and available after the session for those who have registered. Okay, let's get started. We have 5 panelists with us here today. We have Diane Calvi, the CEO of Village Enterprise, Charlie Bressler, the Executive Director of The Life You Can Save. We also have Nathaniel Goldberg, the Director of Social Protection at Innovations for Poverty Action, or IPA. We have Elijah Goldberg, the Chief Operating Officer and co-founder of Impact Matters, and Michelle Kaffenberger, the Senior Research Advisor at the World Bank Partnership for Economic Inclusion. Now, before we dive in, we thought it would be helpful to provide a very quick overview of IPA's role in this space, what an RCT is and why it's important, and why we were really excited to partner with Village Enterprise on this evaluation. So if we just zoom out for a second to the really big picture, we'll be reminded that there are still 767 million people living in extreme poverty, even though rates of poverty are going down. That's a lot of people. And as we all know, a lot of programs exist and a lot of funding is dedicated to fixing the problem. In fact, about $134 billion are spent on anti-poverty programs each year. But historically, we haven't known much about which programs are working, and among those that are reaching their goals, how cost effectiveness compares across programs. That's why in 2002, IPA was founded by Dean Carlin, who was then a professor at Yale. Since that time, IPA has conducted 650 evaluations in 51 countries. And IPA's mission is to discover and promote solutions to global poverty problems. Or even more simply put, our vision is to have more evidence and less poverty. And we achieve this vision by doing 2 main things. We create high quality evidence, and we help turn that evidence into better programs and policies for the poor. And the way we create high quality evidence is with the same method that's used in medicine and other sciences to reliably test what works and what doesn't. That's with randomized control trials, or RCTs. With RCTs, you take a group and you assign people by lottery or by chance to either a treatment group or a control group, and you follow those groups over time. Any changes that emerge over that period, you can safely say are caused by the program. So IPA was very excited to partner with Village Enterprise on an evaluation of their program, because with this study, we were able to test not only the impact of their full integrated program, which you'll hear more about in a moment, but the individual components of the program. And why that's important is that this allowed us to shine light not only on BE's program, but more generally on what makes graduation style programs tick. Is it just one component, or is it multiple components all together at the same time that matters? This study helped us begin to unravel these questions, and we'll hear more about that in just a moment. But first, let me turn it over to Diane, who will tell us more about Village Enterprise's model, their motivation to do an RCT, and the study's main findings. Let me turn it over to you, Diane.
Thanks, Laura. Thank you to Laura for moderating, and to Innovations for Poverty Action for co-hosting this webinar with us. We're really honored to have all of our panelists and all of you listening to this webinar on our randomized control trial. Village Enterprise is a member of a larger community of graduation players and practitioners and thought leaders that are all working to achieve the #1 Sustainable Development Goal of the United Nations. Players like the World Bank Partnership for Economic Inclusion and Innovations for Poverty Action that are panelists on this, but also others like BRAC, Fundación Capital, Trickle Up, BOMA Project, Results, Uplift, and many others that I have not been able to name, but we're really working together to achieve this important goal. To start, I thought I would go back in time. I thought I'd go back to 2011 when we developed Village Enterprise's first monitoring and evaluation plan. At the time, we had a budget of just a little over $1 million. 30 staff members, mostly East African and many of them part-time, working in remote rural villages. But we had a really big vision, a world free of extreme poverty. And we knew that a small organization like Village Enterprise could only accomplish so much on its own. We felt that one way that we could make a significant impact was to contribute to the growing body of research in poverty alleviation. Our internal monitoring and evaluation indicated that our program had a positive impact on many indicators like food security, nutrition, income, savings, and the overall well-being of women and children. But more importantly, we had all witnessed the transformation that occurred because of our work and the lives of the people that we work with. But we also had a lot of questions, like what outcomes could we attribute to our program? Was it the most cost-effective approach? Could we scale the program and continue to achieve that same impact at scale? These were just some of the questions that we set out to answer when we put in place our plan to do a large-scale randomized control trial. And as you can imagine, it was a big risk for a small organization. But we felt that it was a risk worth taking. Because by doing an RCT, we could contribute to building evidence necessary for potential government adoption and replication through partnerships, and we could play a role in building evidence around what type of programming is most cost-effective. In 2010 and 11, with input from our field team, our business owners, and several of our partners, we made changes to our program that we felt would increase our impact, adding targeting, additional training, more structured mentoring, and a savings component. The Village Enterprise graduation program now combines highly effective participatory targeting to reach the extreme poor, formation of savings groups, mentoring and training by a local business mentor for 1 year, and cash grants for 3-person businesses. This approach equips program participants with the tools and the knowledge they need to start sustainable income-generating businesses and savings groups, effectively paving a path out of poverty. In the last 30 years, we've started over 41,000 businesses, trained over 262,000 new business owners, and transformed the lives of close to 900,000 women, children, and men in Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. In just the past 6 years alone, we've started more than half of those businesses. And while not all of these elements are unique to Village Enterprise, we believe that these are just some of the key factors that contribute to our impact. Our graduation program is a group-based 1-year program that's run by local business mentors. We believe strongly that our frontline team should be recruited from the communities that we work in, and that local leadership is necessary for building trust and better programs. We also believe that the poor should have the power to make decisions about what businesses they want to start, so we provide them with a cash transfer. Village Enterprise has deep experience adapting our program to diverse geographic and cultural contexts in rural Africa, as well as targeting specific groups such as the rural poor and poachers around protected areas. 80% of our business owners are women, so our program is gender sensitive and addresses the specific needs of women. And we're committed to innovation and ongoing data-driven adaptation and learning. This RCT is just one of the examples, and our Impact Matters audit showed evidence of that as well. When we developed the RCT's design, we were eager to test not only the Village Enterprise program, but to also understand how the individual components drive impact. We used a participatory process to identify the poorest 6,378 households across 138 villages in rural Uganda. And then researchers randomly assigned eligible households to one of 6 groups. This was an innovative RCT design in that we weren't just evaluating our program versus a control group at various interventions. The first was the full enterprise graduation program with a cash transfer, a variation of our program with business in a box, all the assets to start a business rather than a cash transfer, the Village Enterprise program minus the savings group, a fully costed unconditional cash transfer arm, and an unconditional cash transfer arm combined with a behavioral intervention, and a control group for comparison purposes. And for the sake of transparency and learning, we made the RCT public so that the results could inform the poverty alleviation sector regardless of the outcomes. So our inline results were measured the impact of the program a year after the programming ended and found the following: sustained statistically significant increases across all important poverty alleviation indicators, increases in consumption, assets, and income, as well as improvements in nutrition and food security. People also felt better about themselves and their communities. That was shown with gains in subjective well-being, status, and trust, as well as improved standing of the women in the community when participating in the savings groups. Compared to other poverty alleviation programs that have been evaluated by third-party RCTs, including the other graduation programs that were evaluated around the world, the cost effectiveness of the Village Enterprise program is one of the highest. Researchers estimate a full cost recovery in increases in consumption and net assets within 3 to 4 years, compared to 7 years or more on average of other graduation programs. Many poverty alleviation programs never even pay for themselves in terms of increasing income and assets over time. In addition, we were able to shine light on our program versus an unconditional cash transfer. The cost equivalent unconditional cash transfer had less promising medium-term impacts on poverty reduction and subjective well-being, and when compared to the Village Enterprise program, and adding a light touch behavioral intervention changed the investment patterns of cash transfer recipients and improved subjective well-being, but didn't have a significant impact on the poverty alleviation indicators. So in summary, this RCT provided evidence for this more streamlined group-based approach to graduation. It took 7 years to get to this point of disseminating our inline results. It's been an excellent learning experience for our organization, and we formed important partnerships with Innovations for Poverty Action, World Bank PEI, Impact Matters, and the Life You Can Save as a result of our commitment to research. Some of the things that we've learned in the process are, one, you need to commit to conducting an RCT at scale if you want the effects to be picked up with statistical significance. 2, you should be aware that getting the same results at scale is not as easy when you're operating on a small scale. 3, doing an RCT of graduation programming increases the operational costs of the organization because you have to operate over a larger geography to avoid spillover effects. And there are also additional training and oversight costs to ensure that the staff fully understand and adhere to the study design. 4, and probably most important, you need to be extremely patient. Getting long-term impact results takes multiple years. 5, third-party independent evaluations might lead to different results from your internal monitoring and evaluation. In the case of this study, our internal monitoring evaluation showed higher rates of savings, significantly higher rates of savings than the RCT, and we'll be able to test that further with the RCT that's coming up with the Impact Mom. But nevertheless, despite these challenges, as I mentioned, Village Enterprise is committed to doing another RCT as part of this innovative project, the Development Impact Pond that we launched last year. Based on the strength of the RCT evidence, we were selected among 80 organizations to implement $5.28 million development impact bond, the first of its kind in poverty alleviation, and the largest to date in Africa. We're honored to partner with USA Development Innovation Ventures and DFID as the outcome funders, Global Development Incubator as the trustee, Instiglio as the project manager, ID Insight as the evaluator, and several impact investors that are, I think, listening in today. We will have the opportunity to impact over 90,000 lives and also test some new iterations like a larger cash transfer. But more importantly, contribute to the evidence base for innovative funding mechanisms that have the potential to effectively scale up poverty alleviation efforts globally. So I'm going to turn it over now to Nathaniel Goldberg of Innovations for Poverty Action, who will put this RCT in the context of the other graduation RCTs that have been done to date. Thank you. Nathaniel?
Thanks, Diane. So you've heard evidence from Diane about the RCT, the randomized evaluation that we did with Village Enterprise. And I wanted to share with you the evidence from a larger set of evaluations of graduation programs that we did over the last 10 years. So this was the CGAP Ford Foundation graduation pilots, which were adaptations of BRAC's original Targeting the Ultra-Poor program. And we did randomized evaluations of 7 of these programs. And we were able to pool 6 of these together, which we published in Science in 2015. So you can see the spread of these programs here. And the results are summarized here, where we show across, and this is very much echoes what Diane was sharing about the findings from Village Enterprise. Everything that we looked at, we found positive impacts. So here what you see in the lighter blue bars is the 2-year result. So this is a 2-year program, the programs that we evaluated. And we followed up after 2 years. And then we also followed up a full year later after there were no program services delivered for an additional 12 months. So what you can see is both wide-ranging positive impacts. These are all compared to a control group who did not get the program, and consistency and stability of results from year 2 to year 3. We see improvements in per capita consumption, household assets, food security, time spent working, and physical and mental health. And all of those remain statistically significant at year 3, except for physical health, which drops to be just below that bar. The primary result here is the per capita consumption, which is used to form the cost-benefit analysis. So there you see a point that's measured in standard deviations, 0.12 standard deviations at year 2 and 0.12 standard deviations, exactly the same at year 3. In percentage terms, that's a 5% improvement in household consumption, which I would call a small but meaningful impact. And then we were able to measure that in a couple of the sites, and we have the data from one of those now analyzed in India after a 7-year period. So here it's treatment versus control, treatment in the darker line. And what you can see, there's N line 1, N line 2, and N line 3. And by N line 3, which is the 7-year, that the impacts have not only sustained, but grown over time. That's very exciting to see. We're also, we've collected the data in Ethiopia and we're analyzing that now. Here you can see by country that graduation is cost effective. So what we do is we measure all the costs of delivering the program. So that includes the transportation costs, the asset costs, management time, and we look at the impacts of the program, which is the per capita consumption, the difference between treatment and control. So the impact on per capita consumption, plus impacts on household assets. And what we see is that in 5 out of the 6 programs, there's a positive return on investment. So the households derive more in benefits than it costs to deliver the program. You'll note that in Honduras, there is not a positive impact of the program. And in this case, it's because the 80% of the households chose chickens, and those chickens died off in large numbers. So this is one of the challenges of doing evaluations with pilot programs. I didn't have time to work out all the kinks, but we were measuring the impact of that version of the program. So graduation is effective, but it's expensive. So at the low end of these programs, it costs $330 to deliver the program in India, and $2,600 at the high end in Peru. The average was about $1,100. So we need to figure out ways of scaling this program in a more cost-effective way. We looked at the distribution of impacts, and what we see is that on some of the households, this is the 90th percentile, the program had really strong impacts on these households. But then there's a range. Down at the 10th percentile of impacts, households are maybe doing a little bit better or not much better at all. And you can see that between N-line 1 and N-line 2, the impacts really dissipate for these households. So we also need to figure out ways to design programs such that these households benefit more from the program. And as we think about scaling, this is where Village Enterprise, the results from this evaluation really come into play. So here we see that a streamlined version of the program, a suite of assets, training, savings, and mentoring, has strong impacts. And this is delivered at a cost that's much, much lower than the programs that we were looking at. So the cost for Village Enterprise was $190 per household, compared to that $330 at the low end of the programs that we looked at. And Diane already mentioned that other programs which did not have that holistic set of services, so looking at just the cash only, did not produce the same benefits for households. So we've learned in other work that we've done that holistic nature of the program turns out to be really important. Concluding thoughts here, graduation is effective. We know that from the evaluations that we looked at. There's another one, a large randomized evaluation of BRAC's original program, and now from Village Enterprise as well. I would say that graduation has only modest impacts on average, but it does have that positive return on investment. And it has huge impacts for some households and doesn't do much for some households. The program is expensive overall, and Village Enterprise is substantially cheaper. So that means that we have now identified a potentially more scalable version of the program. And graduation is one of the very few programs that's rigorously proven to reduce the depth of poverty. So we have something that works, and therefore, in my opinion, we have an obligation to do something for households. The question is, what exactly are we going to scale? What version of this program should be scaled? And for that, we need more research to figure out the optimal combination of inputs to maximize cost effectiveness. So we want to get the impact of the program up, and we want to get the cost of the program down. So we can do things like using technology to increase impact and reduce costs, and linking poor households to high return value chains, connecting them to markets, and so on. It'll take a fair amount of work to get there. Thanks, and I'll turn it over to Michelle.
Great, thanks, Nathaniel. So I want to start by saying congrats to Village Enterprise and to IPA for this excellent study and for the really useful and timely results that it's produced. You can see that there was a lot of foresight in designing this study, which has addressed a number of the key research questions around graduation right now, but it was designed and launched many years ago. So congrats on the contribution to the field. So a little bit of background about the Partnership for Economic Inclusion. We're a global partnership dedicated to accelerating the adaptation, innovation, research, and scaling of the graduation approach, particularly as part of government social protection systems. We are an independent entity housed in the World Bank's Social Protection and Jobs Global Practice, and we operate as a hub for graduation work and manage a global community of practice with over 100 organizations dedicated to graduation. So from within the World Bank, we do advisory work with country governments and World Bank programs and teams that are interested in incorporating graduation type programming into those government social protection systems. And we facilitate connections with partner organizations to do the same type of advisory and TA work, largely organizations from the community of practice. We also fund and spur new research and new innovation around the model through our innovation and learning workstream, which is what I lead. And we help synthesize findings coming out of the field so the whole field can benefit from the new studies and linkages of the findings. And then finally, we have a knowledge management work stream that takes those findings and translates them into trainings, training modules, standards, and best practices. So as you can see, this Village Enterprise RCT touches each of these three main areas. So with the couple minutes that I have, I just wanted to highlight a couple of the ways that this study builds into the work that we do, but also that builds into the questions and the work that the broader field has. So this RCT really contributes in different ways to three of what I would say are the highest priority questions on our learning agenda. The first one, which both Nathaniel and Diane mentioned, but is how to bring the cost of graduation down while maintaining that impact. So as we have these conversations with governments that are interested in building graduation into their social protection systems, so for example, that might look like adding graduation components onto a conditional cash transfer that's already in place, or a basic safety net cash transfer that a government wants to make more productive in some way, so to help people get into a sustainable livelihood. We see there's a lot of interest from governments to do this. And in fact, in the fall, we did a landscaping study where we found that governments from 34 different countries worldwide are leading graduation programs already. But the upfront cost of graduation is a very high barrier for many governments, especially when talking about scaling a program like this. And we also find it's a big question from donors. So how to get the cost down so that scaling can be more feasible. So these rigorous findings that are showing the positive impact of a much less expensive program are extremely useful for showing that it is possible to design a lower cost version of graduation and still maintain those positive impacts. So it's a really great contribution to kind of that set of questions that we have. A second area is, how does graduation compare to alternatives? So again, a question we often get from governments and donors is, how does graduation compare to alternatives for poverty alleviation? Wouldn't a less costly or a less complex program be better? And these are really fair questions to ask, right? These are the questions we should be asking. And a lot of those questions we get revolve around simple cash transfers versus graduation. So the comparison that this study, the design of this RCT had, where it was comparing the graduation program to an equivalent cash transfer arm, is extremely useful for this purposes. So if a government has, say, $100 to spend in a program, should they spend it on graduation, or should they just hand it to recipients? And this evidence suggests that at least for this target population, graduation can have the greater impact. And that's what's really important. Governments want to know how to spend their marginal dollar. And this lends some evidence to informing some of the answers to that question. And then a third question that rises pretty high is also the importance of mentoring or of coaching, which takes different forms depending on the program. But people that are involved in graduation programs on the ground often say that the coaching or the mentoring is one of the most important parts of graduation. Anecdotally, they can see that that's where a lot of the impact comes from. But it's also one of the harder pieces to scale, and it can be more costly. So for governments, the tendency is to consider dropping it when they look at how to adapt a graduation program. So again, this evaluation gives evidence that, one, mentoring can be included in a lower cost package, that there are ways to innovate around mentoring to bring that cost down. And then two, also that, again, that this multi-component approach of graduation, which includes mentoring, does in fact achieve the greater results in this side-by-side comparison of the impact measures. So these kind of areas of evidence are helping to build out the evidence based on some of the questions that we are frequently facing, both within the World Bank and with outside partners and players and donors. And it also gives us a lot of fodder for outreach when we're going to governments or donors that put a high value on rigorous evidence like this, to show how that potential of graduation, to show what that potential is, and to show how it can perform head-to-head with an alternative approach. So with that, those are a few of the high points of how we really see this contributing to what PEI is doing. And I'm going to hand it over to Elijah from Impact Matters to take it from there. Thanks.
Thanks, Michelle. And thank you, Diane, and the whole Village Enterprise team for having us on. We're really thrilled to be talking about our work with you. So my name is Elijah Goldberg. I'm from a group called Impact Matters. We have worked closely with Village Enterprise for a while now. They're the first nonprofit we've ever conducted 2 impact audits of, which is very exciting. So I wanted to first introduce who we are and then talk through both the first audit and our updated audit of Village Enterprise pretty briefly. So Impact Matters conducts impact audits of nonprofits in order to rigorously estimate their philanthropic impact. And we do so to compel those nonprofits and their funders to make evidence-based decisions. We were essentially founded on a persistent problem that I'm sure many of you on the webinar are aware of, which is that although funders pour billions of dollars into nonprofits to boost beneficiary outcomes, very few of them have the technical capacity to actually determine the impact of those grants. And so this leads to two things. First, it leads to billions of dollars wasted on ineffective programs, but even worse, there's the opportunity cost of those dollars. So that means billions of dollars are not being spent on programs that we know to work. We see audits as a tool to change that. So an audit is a professional estimate of a nonprofit's impact and cost. It's accompanied by an easy to use rating of confidence in that estimate, so the reader knows how much faith they should put in those numbers. And it essentially answers the key question: where can the dollar do the most mission good? The benefits, I think, for funders are pretty straightforward. They get to direct their dollar where they actually want it to go. There are also benefits for nonprofits. So each nonprofit receives a letter at the end of the process which details a roadmap for how they can improve their own measurement, as well as a tool that they can use to fundraise moving forward. It's important to note that it's actually not a recommendation system. So similar to financial auditors who don't recommend investors where they should place their money, but simply provide them information, auditors, impact auditors are simply providing conscientious program officers one important piece of information to make their overall decision. So I'm happy to answer questions later or offline about methodology, but to turn to the matter at hand, we approached Village Enterprise pretty early in our process of building Impact Matters. We were interested in them because they were implementing the graduation model, something that we were very keen to understand how it worked in practice, and to apply the external literature to actual implementations of the program. We took a second look at them more recently as a result of the RCT, and that's what I'll be talking about in a second. The first audit, as I mentioned, relied very heavily on external literature. The literature came from mostly from the study that Nathaniel was referencing earlier. The study was high quality. It did everything that you could possibly want to do in terms of controlling for internal bias, controlling for factors that might make it not applicable to other programs elsewhere, not in the study. And we were very happy with using that to reach a benefit cost ratio for Village Enterprise. However, we always have a preference where possible for internal evidence on the nonprofit. And this is because we believe quality of implementation matters quite a bit. You don't want to be sending your money to the Honduras group that isn't providing chickens that are going to survive. And so understanding what's happening internally with the organization is very important to make informed evidence-driven decisions. A comparable example of this is, say, microfinance. Microfinance, there's good evidence now that the vanilla microfinance program doesn't reduce poverty. But that's not to say that there aren't smartly designed variants out there that might be delivering benefits to the recipients. We simply don't know unless we have the internal evidence from the group and have typically a funder who's committed to rigorously analyzing it or supporting somebody else who does. So Village Enterprise came out with its new RCT, and this prompted the second audit. On the benefit and cost findings, we found that the RCT showed that Village Enterprise's programs led to a modest, statistically significant increase in consumption, assets, and income in the treatment relative to the control. This finding was not actually particularly different from what came out of the external literature on other graduation programs, which we see as a good sign. If there were huge differences between VE's findings and others, that might raise eyebrows, but they're more or less in line. The crucial change was our confidence in those estimates. So the randomized trial that we're talking about today was high quality. Going through, we had some minor nitpicks, but there was nothing serious that would jeopardize the findings. And so as a result, we have very high confidence in the new benefit cost findings that we put out for Village Enterprise. Before I wrap up, one caution for any for the audience, because I know there are some nonprofits out there and some others who support them. Village Enterprise has an excellent system and has consistently demonstrated its ability to rigorously test its own program. And to do so, they've invested pretty heavily in evaluation, as well as their partners have invested in their evaluation. I will say that there are easier measurement approaches out there. They don't yield as high quality data, but they still yield useful data. And so for nonprofits who are thinking about boosting their measurement systems, but don't know where to start and don't think that they're quite in a place to jump into a full-scale randomized trial, there are still steps to be taken that are useful and that will give you better evidence to make decisions. And I'm happy to chat more with folks offline about those. So I mentioned that we don't recommend nonprofits. We do, however, provide data for others who do so. And one of those is the Life You Can Save. Life You Can Save was founded by Peter Singer, and it empowers and inspires people to take action to fight against extreme poverty. I'm going to hand it over to Charlie Bresler, their executive director, who will tell you more.
Thanks, Elijah. I want to just comment on Village Enterprise's work. I think starting this 7-year journey was incredibly useful to potential donors who are looking to help alleviate poverty for over the 700 million people living in extreme poverty. And congratulations on a job well done and done not only carefully, but with a tremendous amount of perseverance and really courage, making your results public right from the very beginning. Also, thanks to Impact Matters and GiveWell and IPA that are all really critical for the Life You Can Save to be able to perform its mission, which is to make really good information available in a digestible form for potential donors to shift more money, if you will, to the most effective nonprofits. And more money to the most effective means shifting lots of dollars to international nonprofits instead of the low amount as a percentage that's currently given in the United States. For example, it's less than 6% is going overseas. And so where a dollar does the most good is overseas, as I think this study suggests in part. So I really we couldn't do this work without organizations like Impact Matters, GiveWell, IPA. The central argument in Peter Singer's book was that if we can provide immense benefit to someone at minimal cost to ourselves, we should do so. Peter is a world famous ethicist, and he has made an ethical appeal to people in the book, The Life You Can Save, to think about the value of what they're doing with their dollars, whether it's spending it on themselves and their families or their communities versus what the potential for those dollars could do. The Life You Can Save, which was a derivative of Peter's book that we started and became a nonprofit in 2013, is working really hard to bring Peter's message to new audiences through technology and partnerships. And we believe that the best thing we can do is not to spend our time doing the kind of work that Impact Matters, GiveWell, and IPA are doing, but for us to curate the best information available about great nonprofits and to bring that information to a much wider community, which is our mission. We believe that this mission could be tremendously important in helping organizations like Village Enterprise reach people that they otherwise would not be reaching. Last year, as a sideline, we moved, we believe, $13 to organizations like Village Enterprise that do highly effective work in the developing world for every dollar we spend. Our net impact, we look to have a much bigger net impact than the $3.6 million that we moved last year as we expand our operation. But our ability to gain confidence from potential donors and begin to shift dollars domestically to dollars overseas is absolutely critical for evidence, to have evidence like this RCT. The RCT gives credibility to the work we're doing in suggesting that people should reconsider how they spend their money, not only whether they spend their money on luxuries, but whether they spend their money on really, really effective nonprofits. Some of our nonprofits, of the 20 that our panel of experts recommend, are involved in poverty alleviation. Some are enhancing well-being, like Fred Hollows and SAVA, that work to restore people's sight, or Fistula Foundation that works to perform obstetric fistula surgeries on women and restore them to their own communities in a healthy way. So there's a variety of different causes that are reflected in these nonprofits. Without the work of the evaluators, we could not be trying to engage the donors, which is what we're trying to do. I'm more than happy to talk to people individually about this work and answer any questions. I would like to turn it over to Laura, our moderator now, for our Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlie. And thank you to everybody who's presented this morning. Okay, we're going to begin answering some questions. Just a note that if we don't have time to answer everyone's questions, we will aim to answer those questions over email afterwards. So the first question is for Diane. Diane, you mentioned that it is hard to achieve results at larger scale compared to small scale, yet the ambition is to scale up. So why is it hard to get the results at scale?
As Nathaniel mentioned, implementation of graduation is incredibly important in terms of achieving impact. And because it is a complex intervention than other interventions like an unconditional cash transfer, the quality of that implementation is more challenging to achieve at a larger scale. Just more complexity involved in ensuring that the mentoring is done in such a way that achieves impact, that the training is conducted in a way that achieves impact, and even transferring cash in some of these areas that are very remote can be challenging. And so all of the elements of a graduation program are more challenging at scale, and more challenging in very remote rural areas where most of the ultra poor live, especially in sub-Saharan Africa.
Thanks, Diane. The next question is for Nathaniel. Nathaniel, if you don't mind answering, the question is, what ideas came out of the RCT and your other studies for how to scale the VE graduation model effectively?
Well, I guess I would clarify that the Village Enterprise was kind of operating independently while we were evaluating the other one. So I think it's more like we're learning from each other as we iterate. I would say that some of the things that we're learning from Village Enterprise in terms of how to do a more scalable model that we could test revolve around that kind of lower cost intervention and the group-based model. So this is something that we're taking to other evaluations now and trying out group-based enterprises, which has the potential, it's shown here, that you can lower the cost per person. You can have a more lower cost version of the program, which could potentially have a higher return on investment. So we believe in replication, and these results are really exciting, but we need to test them in other contexts. So we're already starting to do that. So Village Enterprise has a lower cost one with the group-based program without the consumption support. And they also use cash as the asset. And I think that's something that has a ton of potential for scale. Is when you think about most of the households in the 6 that we had studied before chose goats as their assets. And that's a challenge if you think about governments trying to procure goats for thousands and thousands of households throughout a country. But if you can just give them cash and let them procure assets on their own, that might be a much easier way for people to scale.
Thanks, Nathaniel. The next question is for Diane. Diane, are there plans to evaluate the sustainability of impacts of VE going forward, like, for example, 7 years later?
That is something that we're considering, a follow-up to this RCT. We don't have funding for it right now, but it's something we definitely would consider. We have done some long-term studies in the past, but not rigorous RCT types of studies to see what businesses are still operating after 4 years. In the past, it's been 75% of the businesses are still operating, but we would be very interested in doing a longer-term study and extending this study.
Thanks, Diane. Another question is, Can the panelists talk about any of the shortcomings of using consumption as the measure of benefit? Nathaniel, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I mean, if you look at the cost benefit that I had discussed and compare that to the full set of impacts, you could see that there were so many other things like food security and mental health that were just not included. But if you were to include those, you'd have to make a judgment call about the value of them. So we found in the policy world that it's been so important to have this return on investment metric that we can share with policymakers and program implementers. And I think that's been really worthwhile. At the same time, we've shared the other results, but I think that doing it in the kind of simplest way possible, where we're not going out and putting something like a dollar value on those is the best way to do it. But we understand that there's some limitations.
Okay, thanks, Nathaniel. We have another question. I'm not sure who wants to take it. I guess this would also be for Diane. I'm not sure I'm totally understanding it correctly, but how is VE able to provide similar results to other graduation programs? Are they similar? Did we see the comparison at lower costs? How is VE able to provide similar results to other graduation programs? I'm not sure if we can.
I think I can answer that. So when you talk about cost effectiveness, you're looking at what are the impacts in relationship to the costs. So if you have a lower cost program, you potentially are going to have lower absolute impacts. But in the case of the Village Enterprise program, it's very cost effective, which means, and more cost effective than many of the other implementations of graduation, because we were able to achieve greater impact for each dollar spent. So there are two types of ways you can look at impact. You can look at absolute impact. What's the absolute increase in things like consumption and savings and assets? You could also look at the increase of those indicators relative to the cost. And as Nathaniel mentioned, one of the key factors in trying to understand how to scale up graduation, especially at a really large scale with governments, is what is the cost per household. So Village Enterprise was able to achieve increases in all of the poverty alleviation indicators at a very cost-effective rate. And I hope that explains.
Thanks, Diane. Okay, this is a really good question, I think. Somebody asked, funding, guts, and sense of responsibility. How do we make these more widespread to support effective programs? I think almost any of our panelists could potentially jump in on this. Elijah, would you want to take a stab at answering that one or starting us off? Your audio might be muted.
My internet was cutting out. Could you repeat the question?
Oh, sorry. How is VE able to, funding, guts, and sense of responsibility. How do we make these more widespread to support effective programs?
Yeah, I don't think that there's a simple, glib answer to that question. It's certainly one that I would say every organization I've encountered in international development at least cares somewhat about that and is trying, to some extent to expand models that they think work. Our particular take on it is that at the moment there's a lack of comparability on impact, and so anybody who's trying to get into the weeds and understand the differences between different programs really does have to get into the weeds. I mean, it takes a tremendous amount of expertise and time and commitment to figure out how to disentangle all the different models that are out there, all the different studies. Some are high quality, some are low quality. Sometimes it's apparent from the cover page, often it's not. And so I think the value of making comparable, some sort of comparable tool for understanding the impact of these different interventions and how they're implemented by different programs will go a long way towards enabling funders to make the decisions that we think they should make. But that's all speculation at this point. What do you think, Charlie?
I would take a stab at that question. The central mission of the Life You Can Save, when I started in 2013, was to spread this idea of effective giving. And we started with the idea that Peter had said that we have, all things being equal, a moral obligation to fight extreme poverty and the effects of extreme poverty. What we've done over the last several years is to try to make that message an opportunity as opposed to an obligation, that people have a significant opportunity to do amazing good in the world. And the way that we believe we need to spread that message is through technology, through various types of platforms in digital marketing, through traditional marketing, through partnerships. I mean, imagine when you now go to one of many, many retailers, you see that you can give to a charity, but when you look at what those charities are, they're among many times the least effective ways to spend your dollar. So another way to, if I'm understanding this question correctly, to spread the message is to change the way corporations choose their charities. And we're not going to get to a point where 96% of the dollars are going overseas and 4% are going domestically. That would fly in the face of our culture, evolutionary psychology, all kinds of things. But we would like to get to a point where we begin to change the percentage that are going to the most effective charities. So the Life You Can Save, as it gets better and better funded, which is always a challenge, will increase our impact, and therefore the guts and the sense of responsibility will increase our impact through what you might call, in a traditional sense, multi-channel marketing. My own background is in mass marketing. I was part of the team that actually consolidated the tailored clothing industry at the Men's Warehouse. And therefore, we believe that one of the ways to spread the message of obligation and opportunity is in much more marketing, which has been basically, the nonprofit sector has been allergic to marketing. And so we want to sort of give them antihistamines, if you will, to the marketing and begin to use clever strategies for getting people to feel that sense of obligation and opportunity. So that's the short answer to a very long answer that requires a long answer. I'm happy to talk more about it. I hope I understood what the question is.
One more quick point before handing back to you, Laura. There has been one successful point we can point to, one successful event we can point to in terms of changing donor behavior, which is the shift in focus on overhead ratios that was driven largely by the availability of tax data in the 90s and the 2000s in order to construct some pseudo-quantitative measure of effectiveness. Really, indeed, it was not, but it was treated as donors as such and as funders as such, and it led to a huge shift in how nonprofits operated. If you look at their overhead ratios, they dropped from 23% to 18%. So if we can imagine a situation where we have a similar kind of rich set of data on the impact of nonprofits, like VE has provided, both with this RCT, but in the past, even previously with its previous evaluation systems, we can imagine there might be a similar shift towards treating this with the same degree of I don't know, respect, whatever you have, that most donors now pay to the overhead ratio.
Okay, thanks, Elijah. I don't want to cut you off, but I think we just have time for one more question. And then we will answer other questions. A bunch have just come in, so we will answer other questions over email. So hopefully everyone gets their questions answered. This last question is for Diane, and maybe if there's time, Elijah, you could respond as well. The question is, what is the magnitude of differences and impacts that you have seen between internal M&E systems and RCT data? I assume this is referring to graduation in particular. But it says, for example, the savings rates mentioned. Yeah.
I'm actually going to let Celeste Brubaker, our Director of Monitoring and Evaluation, answer that question. Celeste, can you take that question, please?
Sure, I'm happy to. So the magnitude of difference, especially with savings, was pretty large. With the RCT, what we saw was savings impacts of, in 2016 USD PPP terms, just a couple of dollars per household in increased savings, versus our internal M&E data. It can range per cycle and area, but typically we see somewhere from 50 up to even a couple $100 in savings per household. And so there are a variety of things, of elements that can drive these differences. And I'm happy to discuss further on this session or individually if that's of interest, the reasons behind the differences.
And maybe one broader point, which is not specific to VE, but in general, what we see is that internally, less rigorously collected data tends to show larger impacts. The more closely that you measure something, the more rigorously that you measure something, often the effects go down. And so that's not to say that less rigorously measured data isn't useful, but often there isn't enough correction for the counterfactual, for what would have happened in the absence of the program to those participants. And so as a result, you see good numbers that would have appropriately compared them to say a very similar group of people like in an RCT.
And if you
can obviously estimate those counterfactuals.
If you look at the effectiveness, if you look at the effectiveness from the medical literature, they found the same thing, over a long period of time, and that until they started comparing treatment to placebo controls, it looked like all these treatments were incredibly good. But actually, the medical literature sort of guides some of the kind of work we're doing now with nonprofits. And I think it's really important. And again, that's why what Village Enterprise has done is so important to donors.
Yeah, and I think just two things. One of the challenges with our model is it is this group-based approach. So when you're doing the savings groups and the group-based businesses and you follow up with the RCT questionnaires, I think it can be difficult for individuals responding to really quantify what's being saved at the group level and assets that are being purchased at the business group level. So we do have this challenge. The good thing is that we've already done a randomized control trial. We have, even with that challenge, achieved really high cost effectiveness with the first RCT, but the advantage was we're going to be doing a second RCT with the impact bond. And the researchers are aware of this going into it, so we'll be able to take that into consideration as we implement the second RCT with the impact bond.
Thanks, Diane. So many good questions, and we will try to answer everybody else's questions over email. So thank you for sending in all those great questions. Diane, one final one, and then maybe you can wrap up from there, is just, does Village Enterprise have a playbook that can be shared with other development agencies or organizations that want to implement a similar program elsewhere?
Yes, so Village Enterprise recently, last year, has launched what's called Village Enterprise Extend. It is our replication arm. We have in the past, and I'm just going to just end with this, but we do have a history of sharing our know-how with others, and it is part of our strategy is to replicate this model and share that playbook with others so that the model can get replicated more quickly than if we were to just do it on our own. So I'm going to conclude and share my screen now. Thank you, Laura, for moderating the panel and for all of the panelists. Going to go into share screen mode. Okay. Let's see. So as we look forward, it's our intention to continue our partnership-driven approach. As I just mentioned to Michelle, we have an launched a Village Enterprise Extend. It's our goal to transform the lives of over 20 million women, children, and men in rural Africa by 2025. We know that we can't do that alone. To increase the pool of capital available for poverty alleviation, we launched the Impact Bond to scale up, and it was launched in such a way that it can include other service providers that can tap into a potentially larger outcome fund. Village Enterprise is continuing to scale our program in Kenya and Uganda with our own feet on the ground, but we feel that the real opportunity to scale this model is through replication by governments and larger NGO partners. So I can't see my time. Okay. Over the years, Village Enterprises partnered with organizations such as the BOMA Project, Wildlife Conservation Society, and Geneva Global in a technical assistance capacity. And as I mentioned, we recently launched Extend to continue to transfer our model and our know-how to larger NGO partners and governments. We've just recently launched a pilot with Africa Wildlife Foundation in the DRC and a feasibility study with WCS in the Republic of the Congo. We're encouraged by the results of the RCT and hope that they'll provide compelling evidence for others to replicate this cost-effective, evidence-based model to end extreme poverty. At Village Enterprise, we believe in the African proverb, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. So we hope that you all join us in this effort to end extreme poverty, and thank you for joining us today.